Hi, everybody. I have Erik Rasmussen with me today. You are listening to Healing Broken Trust. Erik, thank you for joining me. It's exciting to have you. Um, Erik just let me briefly share some of Erik's story. Erik was a therapist and still is, and has gone through his own situation of being betrayed by his wife and infidelity. And Erik, I just want to kind of, I just want to kind of jump in and get to the point. Just your experience of being betrayed, discovering all this. What were those early days like?
Oh man. You almost you that feeling of having your legs chopped out from under you. Like there's a physical, if you've ever had that happen before, if you played soccer or something, or there's an unsettled nature to all of a sudden the ground that you are standing on to disappear and you fall to the earth, and not really know even how to catch yourself. I remember the day I found out, it was like my brain was trying to compute what was happening because not all the details had come out. It was half of the story in the initial reveal, but there was deception and there was confusion. So I went somewhere that my wife said that she wasn't, and I couldn't understand why she was there. And when I confronted her on it, there had been denial on her spot and making peace with deception and this whole other story for so long. I was catching up late, but she was practiced at it. She'd been lying to me for months, really, our whole marriage in some degree, not necessarily about affair stuff, but just about old wounds and stuff like that, hiding stuff. But it was just kind of second nature, and for me, it was extremely confusing. And so, I mean, I kept putting the story. If you're going through this, you'll know what I mean. You keep putting the story back together in it correctly because your spouse won't tell you the truth. All you want to do is fix it. And so you take the pieces that you have and you keep trying to put them together and they don't fit. And so then you come back and you say, this doesn't make any sense. And then more pieces keep coming out. And you're so desperate to put it together and heal and get back to healthy or whole or whatever you thought that was, that it's almost like somebody who has a puzzle and shoving the piece in even though they can tell it doesn't fit. They're just trying to make it go in there. I remember for that season, for about 2 months, my wife wouldn't be honest with me after I found out what happened. She just kept revealing small pieces by small pieces. It was always the worst side of the story. You get 80% of a confession, the last 20%, the worst part that was held back. It was always in self-preservation, making sure she protected herself. Um, but I remember a month later, she would tell me a truth about something that she had previously lied about. And so I'd have different narratives in my mind, and I couldn't even remember what was set out to be true. And it was funny because she's like, "How do you remember exactly what?" Because she was trying to figure out what was she had said and what she had been dishonest about. And I said, "I don't have different stories. I'm only remembering what you told me. Like I'm not trying to." She's trying to filter through which versions she's going to tell me or what's the best version of the deception. And it's such a confusing time. Talk about insult to injury. So that having your legs knocked out from under you, that sense of betrayal, your whole life gets turned upside down. The one person in life that was never supposed to hurt you, the one person. Go through life, people hurt you all the time. People betray you. You lose friendships, you gain friendships, you lose business partners, you that kind of thing. But then there's this person who's got your back, and you trust that. And then for that to come out that they've betrayed you in the worst way that they could, um, it's just a pain that I've never known before. But after that, to continue to be lied to, and all you're trying to do is repair, you can walk away. You can bail at that point. You can say, peace. You've done what you shouldn't have done. I'm done with you. You're fighting to make it work. And then to continue, it's like somebody slapping you in the face over and over and over. You can't see it coming because you're trying so hard to believe and you just keep getting lied to. Um, you actually said this at the conference, but you said some version of some people say that the deception following the discovery is actually just as painful. And I think for me, because of how long it went on and how problematic it was and how much I was trying to invest and save the relationship, um, it was a really, really, really tough season. We got into therapy quickly. We got into people who were good intentioned. We met with our pastor. We met with a therapist. Um, no one was able to help us in a way that we were getting better. There was some good, like there was nuggets in there that were helpful, but it was very much like drowning. And I realize now so much of that was because my wife wasn't honest. You can't even begin to heal until both of you guys are willing to be honest and face the story for what it is. So we were stuck specifically at that point, before we found the conference. So essentially, that season was hell. And it was not wasn't for a lack of effort. I was trying to do everything I possibly could. It was just hell. It was the weirdest thing to be putting that much effort into being reconciled to someone, and they hold a key, they hold a lock, and you don't have a key. Like there's nothing you can do about it. So.
Yeah, Eric, I want to ask you, you guys did, uh, you spoke to an individual therapist and they basically told you they couldn't help you. And then you did marriage counseling. And as a therapist, you also did marriage counseling. Like what, I guess, just what was that like being somebody who is a therapist who's even helped people work through infidelity and talk to people who've been dealing with big injuries and big wounds like this, and then to find yourself in that kind of situation? What was that like?
So there wasn't like a pride, it wasn't as much of a pride thing for me where I was like, oh, this can't be my life. Like I accepted that pretty early with it. And a lot of people do struggle with that, where they get stuck at acceptance for the person who's betrayed. I've had other things in my life that didn't go my way, and it was just some part of me that was able to say fairly quickly, like, hey, this is the story, so get on board, or like, um, but yeah, it was hard because the therapist that we were working with wasn't a bad person. They were even, I would say, very well educated. But unfortunately, affair recovery is an extremely difficult arena, and most therapists aren't equipped. I don't think, I've never even heard of a program in a graduate school. I'm sure there is somewhere, but not at mine. I haven't heard about others where they do a specific course on affair recovery. So you take what's essentially the hardest thing to recover from for a marriage, and then you have people who have good intentions and are trained in like tangential areas like trauma work or betrayal. But the specific work of how that recovery works seems to be a big blind spot. And so, we actually found the podcast, the Healing Broken Trust podcast. I had a friend who had been through it, something similar, and had told me about it. And that was like drinking. For the first time, it felt like we were getting somewhere with understanding what had gone on. Now, it was all still super blurry. That was one of those times to joke, because we listened to the podcast on limerence. My wife was extremely limerent. She hit nearly every checkpoint for it. And we listened to that, and she goes, yeah, I don't think that's me. So we're trying to understand what's going on. But if you can't face the story with honesty, there's just so much clarity that doesn't come. And it's really hard to watch that happen, even as you work with people or understand these things in stages. And it's like you can see it as the person watch it happen, but until that person's ready to face the story for what it is, it doesn't really, you just kind of get locked out. So our therapist person we were working with wasn't unwilling. She was trying to help us, but she started going down a completely wrong direction. She was diagnosing Katie as a possible sex addiction, even though none of her actual actions would typically resemble that. But that's kind of what therapists do. A lot of therapists have a school or an understanding through which they're trained, and this person was a CSAT, certified sexual addiction therapist. And so she had a program, she had an understanding of how to help somebody in that context. Katie had an overlap with part of that, so let's just use that as the solution. And I was extremely leery of that, because it didn't seem like that was what was actually going on. And I know that the investment of that strategy is long and expensive, and I knew I couldn't wait around to watch her go through that. So that's when we found the podcast and we found out about the conference. I was like, we have to do this. And thankfully, even though my wife wasn't being honest, even with herself yet, she had wanted to save what we had enough that she was willing to go to the conference, which was a godsend for us, for sure.
Yeah, she was willing to come to the workshop. Eric, let me ask you about, I've never asked you about the podcast. What was that like, just finding that, just your friend telling you about it? Hey, listen to this helped us, and you guys listening to it in those early days. What was that like?
Yes, I remember the first thing you do, and this is coming from somebody who's a therapist. Remember that, y'all. The first thing you do is you start Google searching. What do I do? How do I do it? And you find all these articles that have 10, there's like copy and pasted from 100 different sources. Here's the 10 types of affair. Here's the affair of this, the affair of this, the affair of this. And you try to figure out what's happening and why and all that. And You basically wear yourself out after about 2 hours. You'll find that the articles are pretty much just people that are taking from each other and rewriting the same thing over and over again. So when we found your podcast, there was new information that I hadn't interacted with prior to that I found extremely helpful. And that's what kind of instilled some hope, like this is worth the investment. And at this point, Katie and I had been laboring for a couple months, and it wasn't like a little effort every now and again. I mean, it was like every bit of everything we had, all of our free time went to trying to resolve this. And so we had been through many, many stages of deception and the stories changing, all that stuff. So we basically came to the workshop, and it was kind of a, hey, this is it. This is like the, if this doesn't work, like we just need to go our own ways. Because I couldn't continue to put that much effort and have so little payout. It was it was an impossible, story to keep living over and over again.
Eric, you had mentioned before talking to maybe 10 couples, something like that, about what had happened. A lot of people don't share details of what happened. You had shared what had happened to you with maybe 10 couples, and you discovered something about false forgiveness.
Yeah, you mentioned that at the workshop, and that was a huge light bulb, which people do this all the time. You and I probably do it sometimes when we shouldn't, but we just want things to get better. And so a lot of times we will expedite the forgiveness process to alleviate the feeling of disagreement or problems between us. And so we won't get what we need to forgive somebody, like even to understand it. Like you can't say you forgive somebody if you don't even understand what happened. That's a pretty foolish thing. You can't get back into a relationship with somebody if you don't understand what the offense was and make sure you're safe again. So like, but people don't want to sit in a discontented state. And so they'll offer forgiveness that's good intended, but it doesn't have the materials to function the way forgiveness is supposed to function. So what we found when we started sharing our stories, people were coming out of the woodwork because we were just trying to get help. Well, people were coming out of the woodwork and said, "We've been there, we've been there, we've been there," over and over and over. We had about 10 different couples, and I think all but two had used a version of false forgiveness. It's too hard to deal with, but we don't want to split up. So let's just agree to play nice and to make the best of this and move on and move forward. And so what happened is through our sharing we had two different couples that, and actually there's three now, I say that they started fighting again because they weren't actually resolved, but they had put that kind of false band-aid over it. So the injury was still there. And so our story had enough overlap with theirs that they were trying to help us, and they eventually were like, we can't talk to you guys anymore. Not because we don't want to, not because we don't love you, but like it's causing us problems. Like false forgiveness doesn't allow you to bring it back up or to deal with it, or it forces a quick and a quick burying of it that doesn't actually resolve anything. And so people who practice false forgiveness, this is the worst part. They'll just continue to live in some version of the trauma of the affair for the rest of their lives. Things will trigger them 30 years later. Um, so false forgiveness, and I don't have that. Katie my wife would definitely say that. I think for her that was a desirable move, is to minimize the depth of the emotion and kind of, but I never had anything for me that there was no part of me that was going to go for false forgiveness. Like I had no interest in pretending as if things were better. We were going to either fix it or call it, but we weren't going to sit in the in between.
Eric, I want to ask you, what was the turning point for you guys? You guys have listened to the podcast. You guys have done individual therapy. You guys did marriage counseling. What was the real turning point for you guys?
I didn't appreciate it at the time because I thought I always had given her this. Was her believing that I could love her no matter what. Um, so she grew up believing that she wasn't good enough. Deep down, it wasn't like a super on the top level recognition. Certainly never something she never, not something she ever told me. But whenever we got married, she carried that belief into our marriage. So I never had this thought process that like she's not good enough or I don't. Um, but but she believed that about herself, and then I didn't realize that she was still carrying that. So there was this self-present, she was protecting herself essentially. One of the exercises we did at the workshop, I was actually surprised by it, but it was kind of the question of, if I could go back and do it all over again, would I still choose you? And I was able to tell her, yeah, with genuineness. Like it was, I truly I truly would choose her. I'd do it again today in a heartbeat. Like I love her. I believe in her. And so I didn't realize how much of her hiding of the story had to do with her own insecurities. And so me being able to reassure her that she's safe and that I do love her and that I do want her and that I do choose her, it gave her, I think, probably a foundation to challenge that idea that she had to hide who she was or she had to hide what she had done. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. It was almost like before your guys' marriage could get better, she had to be reassured that no matter what she told you, you would still choose her again. She needed some reassurance that she was still lovable and good enough. And
Yeah,
that,
and that's the crazy part for me. Always believing that she was enough. That was the weird, like it was like, wait a minute, you don't know this? Like that so many times we're scared to ask for what we need and our spouses can't give it to us only because they think we already have it. Like
yeah, it's true.
so
Yeah.
that was it. She wasn't brave enough, I think, to ask, would you still choose me? She'd be terrified of the answer. But us doing an exercise that forced that question, it felt so good for me to believe that I would choose her, but then to be able to tell her that. It was like not only did I need to know that, but she especially needed to know that. Like that was a really, really important thing for her to know.
Because anytime people get hurt, anytime somebody gets hurt, what happens is that feeling of being chosen gets destroyed. But there's not a process of repairing that and restoring that. And so that's kind of where that came from. But it is very healing to have that because a lot of folks who've been betrayed naturally are going to have that question. But then the person who's been unfaithful is going to have that question. I've done too much. Can you look at me the same? Can I be forgiven? And being affirmed and reassured really helps people be able to engage more. And it really helps people give what they need to be giving. Um, and that, Eric, it sounds like that's also when things begin to change for her, but also allowed her to kind of start giving those things to the marriage. Like she knew you would choose her again and still accepted her and loved her in spite of the normal chaos that we feel after being betrayed, like the anger, the confusion, the questions, like her knowing that in spite of Eric being so destroyed, he would still choose me. And then that allowed her to engage and and to begin to be that healer that we need.
Yeah, and that terminology which we use now is that proximity seeking. So we really, I don't think we'd practiced that in earnest prior to. Maybe a little more on her side, but that's just the proximity seeking is like I'm going to practice total and complete vulnerability with you, and I'm going to trust that you'll take care of me. I'm going to share the things that I haven't figured out with you yet. Most of the time we're comfortable sharing difficult things once we process through and we've come to the answer, but it's especially in the spot where we don't know what to say or we don't know what to do, or actually struggling with stuff ourselves. We're like, I don't want to do this, but I'm struggling with it. Like it's that space where we get to talk through it, and it was that story you've heard many times, but watching that TV show and her coming to me and saying I'm struggling with this, like it's that exact space that she needed. She needed to know that she was safe so that she could practice proximity seeking, essentially.
Yeah, she
And
became,
her practicing proximity seeking with me made me feel safe to practice it back with her. So
yeah,
it's a very reciprocal reality. I was holding back because I was scared. She was holding back because she didn't think I would love her. And it's like once these pieces start to come into play, then she starts reinvesting with the general fear, things that are problematic, but she's honest. And then I can meet her in a very similar spot. And so,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, she was able to be vulnerable, let her guard down, come to you, and and that created a positive cycle where she's being honest and transparent with feelings and emotions, which restores, helps your trust. But at the
And then
same time,
I meet
yeah,
her similar.
yeah, you're able to meet her and accept her. Like it creates a positive cycle. That's important. So, Eric, a common question that people have is the podcast has been amazing. I've loved it. It's helped me so much. And now I'm hearing Brad talk about this workshop. Why should I do the workshop when the podcast has been great?
I'd liken it, the podcast is probably like an elementary education. It really gives you a foundation for understanding. And the workshop takes everything to a deeper level. So if you're talking about something in the podcast, you talk about it in a more expansive way that creates more understanding and opportunity for action. There's things that not even are covered in the podcast where the conference takes you specifically into doing some trauma work as well as doing practical work towards one another. And maybe the most valuable reality to it is a lot of people, and I'd say the majority of them, end up listening to the podcast by themselves, and they'll send those to their spouse in hopes that they'll listen to them. And it's almost like you're toying with what recovery might look like. But when you get to the workshop and you guys are both there and present, and you're doing nothing but focusing and working on this for 3 days together, the potential for a genuine restart towards healing is so different than a learning journey when you're driving in your car, to the point that when you leave, there's no questions left about what to do. There's no pieces where it goes, well, I don't understand this. Everything is laid out with such clarity, and you even get this roadmap of what to do. Now, the work still comes beyond that, but it gives you all of the pieces to step into that in full. And really what the workshop offers is the accountability for both people to be together on this journey, which is a lot different than what, the podcast typically does.
Erik, a crazy thing about you is that you now work for us and you also
Yeah.
host workshops. And so that's incredible. Like, you were a therapist who had gone through this. You've been a marriage counselor and unfortunately went through this yourself. And now you're somebody who has walked in the shoes of our own listeners on the podcast. And now you help people who've been betrayed, and help couples and people who've been unfaithful. Do you just want to kind of say something about that?
Yeah. I think it's a bit of a unicorn scenario, and this isn't meant to it's not an ego thing. It's just a reality. So most people, when they go through a fair recovery, they keep it very close to the chest. And if they make it to the recovered part, which is kind of what you're hoping for, they just don't ever want to think about it or deal with it again.
It's true.
And Katie and I, both of us feel very strongly this was a completely terrifying and terrible season. Understanding why it happened was incredibly enlightening to us. We see the whole world differently now. Understanding our trauma, our injuries, and then how they contributed to our lives, both of us. It feels like a story that it has to be told. And so then you look at my training prior to, and understand, it's like, so it was like everything was set up so that I can help other people. And I made this comment to you earlier. You were like a shepherd for us. We needed someone who would believe that recovery was possible and then help us along the way. And now I get to do that. Like, that's my job. I get to help people because I've walked through, this is a unicorn part. Because I've walked through it, the understanding, the depth of that is just at a different kind of understanding than like someone who's studied it and read a book about it or something. And so it's a story I wish I never had to go through, but it certainly brings a whole lot of meaning to it. And so, like, every day I wake up and I sit down with people, and we do trauma work, and we do coaching and some talk therapy to help people work through and find hope and find restoration and find healing. And it's so amazing to watch couples genuinely find that. It's not just, I think some people get discouraged, and it's like, well, you say all this, but then no one can do it. It's like, hey, I'm living proof. Like, my wife and I both put that effort in there, and we both fought like hell to save our marriage, and we have a great marriage. And we are willing to help our story or share our story in hopes that it can help other people. And the crazy part is, and our story so well, like, there's so much overlap between most adultery stories. And so our story has so much overlap. When we share our story, almost everybody goes, oh my gosh, that's just like us in this regard. And there's never the same, but there's always so much overlap. People don't do bad things from healthy places. So, like, understanding the injury part, understanding where this comes from, it's just, and it's so relieving for people, because they can go, oh, I'm not a bad person. I made some mistakes because I've had hurts. And that's, anyway, we could get into all of the weeds of the theory and the understanding, but I get to come to you to workshops now. I help people actually in person there, helping you some with the teaching of that, and then doing the coaching and some of the therapy stuff and the group work. So
Erik, thank you so much. If you guys want to work with Erik or come to a workshop, visit us online at healingbrokentrust.com. Love to meet you in person. Until next time, thanks, guys.
bye, y'all.